young fire-breathing district attorney all those years ago, I never dreamed I would be standing in the annual meeting or annual convention for the Texas Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, speaking as your keynote speaker. So it's a little bit of a different thing for me. And you know, Kristen mentioned some things. I don't think that I have nearly as compelling a story to tell as some other speakers that perhaps she might have chosen, and she mentioned one of them was Juan Melendez, who I shared the stage with up in Dallas. I heard his story. Juan, as she mentioned, spent over 17 years on Florida's death row and then was exonerated. I listened to his story 3 times in 3 days, and it was fascinating. I could listen to it again and still be fascinated by it. It wasn't a death penalty case, but the Michael Morton case is also fascinating. About 2 years ago, when I was still in the prosecution business, in the prosecution office, I sat in a ballroom full of prosecutors in Galveston, Texas, and listened to Michael Morton tell his story to over 1,100 district attorneys in the state of Texas. Virtually every elected district attorney in this state was there. And I can tell you that you could literally have heard a pin drop in that auditorium. And I watched as all of those prosecutors gave Michael Morton a standing ovation, a sincere standing ovation. Now that tells me that things are changing. Things really are changing. Why was I invited here? I wondered about that. I guess it's because, and I thought about what I wanted to say here in this speech several times, and I tore up several versions and threw them in the trash because I started to talk about the numbers and the way the numbers are changing and public opinion is changing, but you know all that. All of that is going to be talked about a lot here during this conference today. But I guess the thing that I have to offer, the thing that I can say to you is that I have made that decision, the decision to seek death, to decide who lives and who dies. Just to give you a little bit of idea about how I came to do that, let me tell you a little bit about my background. I grew up in a little town up in North Texas called St. Joe. Population about 1,000. It was then, it still is. Some of them are the same people. And I went to high school there, graduated in 1977, went off to college and law school, wound up in law school here in Austin, and went to work for the Texas District and County Attorneys Association while I was in law school as their law clerk. And, as I watched all these district attorneys come in, and it was the prestige and the status of that position appealed to me. And so I caught the political bug and decided that I would return home and run for district attorney. And that's what I did. I went back home and took on a 3-term district attorney and defeated him and walked into office. In 1993, I was 31 years old, one of the youngest elected district attorneys in the state. And I had very little experience. I'd left Austin less than 2 years before that. I had very little trial experience. I was the only attorney in the office. But that was okay because it was this little place where nothing ever happened. It was just a little county where nothing happened. Before I was done, I'd prosecuted more than 30 murder cases. And 18 of those were capital cases. So 18 times in my career as a prosecutor, I had to sit down and decide, will I seek death? Will I seek life in this case? So I learned a lot about that. I learned a lot about the factors that go into it. One thing that struck me and always did was how much power that puts in one person. If you think about it, the district attorney at that point in a death penalty case, it's the only time that one person can lock himself in a room and make the decision about life and death and not have to at least be deliberate with others as jurors do, as judges do. One person. It's a lot of power to put in the hands of one person. I came to believe it was too much power. Too much power in one person because we don't know who that person is. I mean, I'm not going to name any names. Actually, I will name a couple of names a little later, but there are a couple, there are more than a couple, who shouldn't have that power, should never have had the power. The factors that I saw, some of them were the things that you might expect, you know, but do I have the budget? Do I have the staff to take on a capital murder death penalty case? I'll tell you that most small counties don't, but sometimes you do it anyway. I prosecuted one case and read headlines in the local newspaper that the county had to raise the tax rate for that one case, that one death penalty case. But there are factors that aren't talked about. And some of those factors are factors that you won't hear district attorneys talk about or admit. One of those is status. One of those is career enhancement. You know, I sat and watched and got to know all of the prosecutors in the state. You know, you don't make it to the upper echelon of prosecutors until you've done a death penalty in Texas. Perhaps 2 or 3. It's a status symbol for prosecutors. It's the Super Bowl. It's where they want to go. It's where you want to be if you're a prosecutor. So part of it is simply a status symbol. It's a career-enhancing thing for a prosecutor. And for some of them, that's all it is. Some other things that you might not have ever considered that go into that decision, you know, you do know this. One thing you do know is that it matters. The most important factor in whether death is sought in your case is where it happens. Now how crazy is that? Because if you commit the same crime in one county, you'll have the death penalty sought against you, and the same crime won't in another county. So think about that. The most important factor in seeking the death penalty in the state of Texas is where did it happen? Is that right? That should not be the way it is. It should be more uniform than that. We ought to be able to have a system, if we're going to have the death penalty, that is more uniform than that. And that's one of the huge problems with it. One thing that prosecutors always consider is politics. I don't have to tell you that prosecutors obviously run for political office. When you're sitting there deciding whether you're going to seek the death penalty in a case, you're a liar. And I'd look a prosecutor in the eye and say that. If you don't admit that when you make that decision, in the back of your mind is, how's this going to affect my re-election? Now that's an issue that should never be involved in the decision to take someone's life. I think that the hardest thing for me over the years, and I was never a huge death penalty fan, even when I was seeking the death penalty, I was known as a prosecutor who would say that I'm not really a big fan of the prosecutor. Of the death penalty, and some prosecutors. In fact, I was one of the first prosecutors who advocated for life without parole in this state. And you would not believe the number of district attorneys and prosecutors who were against that, simply because they knew the effect that it was going to have, which would be that it would reduce the number of death sentences, which is exactly what it did. And because they knew that juries would pick life without parole over death, if they knew that someone they considered to be, or that they believed to be, a very dangerous person was going to spend the rest of their life in prison, as opposed to this idea that the prosecutor is going to sell to the jury that someday this person might get out. So you've got to vote for death because someday this person might get out. And that's what life without parole took away, was that argument. This conference is about change, and I think
point it that way. Point it at that way. You got to point it at that.
There we go. Okay. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. Can we have the next slide? Right here. Deoxyribonucleic acid. Anybody know what that is? It's DNA. That's our little friend DNA. I think that had more to do with what's happening in this state than anything else. I remember when DNA first came along, and I was a young prosecutor. Actually, it was just before I became a district attorney. But when DNA first came on the scene back in the early 80s, or in the late 80s and early 90s, it was a great thing. It was a great thing for prosecutors. It still is. DNA is one of I think, the greatest advance in forensic science that's ever happened. It has the ability, think about it, gives us the ability to put a DNA profile into a computer and punch a button and solve a case that has gone unsolved for maybe 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. It's a great tool. But along with the good came something else with DNA. Along with the good came the realization that we had gotten it wrong a lot more than we thought. And that's what DNA did and what it is still doing. And there are still a lot of prosecutors and still a lot of district attorneys who will stand out there and tell you that nobody who is innocent has ever been executed. And there's nobody on death row who is innocent. And I was never one of those, and I'm not one of those now. DNA showed us differently. And we really ought to be able, and we were talking about this at the table during the lunch, when we know that someone's innocent, we really ought to do everything we can to get them out, to make it right, to fix the mistake. I don't know why there are prosecutors who think that the system is more important than innocence, because it isn't. Innocence is the most important thing in the system. And the death penalty isn't worth one innocent life. You'll hear prosecutors argue that point. Believe it or not, there are many prosecutors who will argue that, well, we can accept an innocent execution now and then to preserve the death penalty. That's amazing to me. I cannot believe anybody could think that way. It's just not worth it. And we have shown that we can't do it correctly. We have shown that it's not perfect. I want to talk to you a little bit about some of what I call the voices of change. If we can go to the next slide. There have been some voices recently in Texas that have begun to talk about change and have demonstrated some of the great changes, the very important changes that are beginning to happen. Go ahead and go to the next one. Anybody recognize that? Based on my specialized knowledge of this process, I now conclude that the death penalty as a form of punishment should be abolished.
Justice
Anybody
John
recognize
Stevens.
that? The lawyers may.
Justice
Go
Stevens.
ahead. Give me the next. Go ahead and give me the next. That's Judge Tom Price. November 2014, in his dissent that he wrote in the Panetti case. Now that was not a huge surprise to anyone who had known about Judge Price's opinions in the past. He's come close to saying that before in the past, so it was not a huge shock for him to say that. But let's look at the next one. All those DNA exonerations woke a lot of people up. I think we knew there were mistakes, but we thought it was maybe a 1 in 50 million kind of thing. Clearly, it was much worse. They know who that is? Judge Kathy Cochran said that in an interview that was published this month in Texas Monthly. Now, if you think about that, how amazing that is, how big a change that is from the past. Those are two members of the highest court, criminal court in the state of Texas, former members, who had a vote in every death penalty that came down in this state in the last decade and a half, now expressing these kinds of thoughts about the death penalty. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. And this is also something that Judge Cochran said in her interview. She said, "It wouldn't bother me if the death penalty went away. But it will not go away by critics being holier than thou. It will be the slow accretion of feeling that is just not worthwhile." Now, I'll confess I had to look up the word accretion because I'm a country redneck, so I didn't know what accretion meant. I know Judge Cochran. I've known her for years, since she was a prosecutor before she became a judge. And that's just the way she talks. She's brilliant. She's a scholar. But I'm just a redneck, so it means slow growth. That's what Webster says it means. Let's go to the next one. And then some brilliant scholar made this statement. "Over the years, I've come to believe that the time for the death penalty is past. The death penalty will be given less and less until the day when the state no longer needs to take a life to make a point." Anybody know who that brilliant person was?
Greg Abbott.
No, that was me. I'm kidding about the brilliant part of it. That's the statement I made in the article, or in the story that Kristen was talking about earlier. The death penalty has a face. And I want to talk about that more at the end of my presentation. I want to talk specifically about that because that case had a powerful effect on me. And probably shaped my feelings about the death penalty from the very beginning as a prosecutor. Let's go to the next one. This is also Judge Cochran. The average time between sentence and execution is about 9 years. And when you separate the crime and the punishment that much, what good is it doing the victim? What good is it doing anybody? Again, a member of the highest criminal court in the state of Texas is questioning whether the death penalty has any good quality or any effectiveness at all because of the length of time that it takes to execute. How about the next one? This was an astounding statement that Judge Cochran made. I mean, this just astounded me. Human beings are going to make mistakes, and I'm sure innocent people have been executed. Now, that's an admission I don't think you would have heard from a member of the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals until very recently. And then she went off the cart. She went off the path. Because then she said, so do you not execute people at all because the system is infallible? Her answer is no. And then I kind of shook my head when I read that and said, you were doing so well. You were doing so well until you got to that point. Because she was talking about how the system is infallible. It's run by people. It's run by human beings, so we're going to make mistakes. And I agree with that. That's one of the reasons why I came out eventually against the death penalty. Because we're going to make mistakes. We can't do it perfectly. And if you can't do it perfectly, we can't do it at all. So I disagree with that statement. That's kind of like I was talking about earlier, where a prosecutor argues that, well, we can live with an innocent being executed every now and then to keep the system. The problem or the error in that reasoning is this. That's equating the death penalty with the rest of the criminal justice system. That's equating death with every other punishment that we have in the criminal justice system. If you think about that, because with everything else, we can at least fix the mistake. We can at least do something about the error. You can't do that with the death penalty. We make a mistake with the death penalty, there's no going back. There's no fixing it. There's no unexecuting a person. So that's why it's different. And that's where I disagree with Judge Cochran. So let's look at the next one. And I'll just go ahead and tell you, this is, again, one of my brilliant statements that I made in my article that I wrote. When it comes to the death penalty, can we accept anything less than perfection? Can we really, when the state seeks to take a life, there is no acceptable margin of error. and that's what I believe. I believe that if we can't be perfect when it comes to the death penalty, then we can't have it, because there is no acceptable margin of error. The death penalty is surrounded by politics. I mean, it is bound up and wound up with politics. And before I say where I think we're going with that, let me point out something that the three of us, who I just mentioned there, myself and the two judges, there's something that we all three have in common. Have you noticed what that is? Exactly. We all three waited until there were no more election campaigns before we said what we said. Because both of the judges, one was on the way out, and the other one was out of office when they made their statements. And that's the reality of the death penalty in Texas. You don't have an election for a district attorney, for a judge, for a senator, for a representative, for a governor, for an attorney general in Texas without being tough on crime and in favor of the death penalty. And there's never, in my opinion, going to be a legislative end to the death penalty in Texas. I don't think that we'll get all of those people to vote to abolish the death penalty, at least not until there are a lot more change comes. And I suppose I should never say never. But I do think the death penalty is coming to an end. That's what I said in the article. Let's go ahead and, I think we're at the beginning of the end of the death penalty. And that's the statement that I made in that article and that essay that I wrote, and what I believe is that we're seeing the beginning of the end of the death penalty. But I don't think in Texas, I mean, we're going to hold on to it with cat claws as long as we can until someone tells us we can't do it anymore, and that's how it's going to happen. I think that the United States Supreme Court, within our lifetime, is going to eventually get to the point where enough states have abolished the death penalty where they will then hold that it's cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment, and it will be gone. That's how I think the death penalty will go away, and I think we're headed that direction. The last slide that I have up there is talks about the story that I was talking about earlier, my personal story. And let me tell you how this story came to be. About late in 2012, I decided that I was going to leave prosecution. It's been 25 years in prosecution, and I was ready to do something else. So I was laying in bed one night and thinking about the cases that I prosecuted, and thinking about one case in particular that always haunted me. And so I said to my wife, I think I'll write a story. And she, was reading something and she said, "Yes, dear, of course." And I said, "Well, I think I'll write it and send it to my friend Pamela Koloff at the Texas Monthly, and let's just see if we can get it put in Texas Monthly." And she looked at me and said, "Yes, dear, of course. You write one article and send it to Texas Monthly. You don't, start at the top. If you're going to write something, you might as well start at the top." So I wrote this article over several days, weeks, in the evening, lying there in bed, a little here, a little there. I'd show her, by the way, my wife is here, Sherry. I'd show her a little bit of it, and she'd read it and say, "That's pretty good. I like that." I thought, of course I thought she was lying to me, so I sent it off to an email to Pamela Koloff, who I hadn't talked to in years, but I'd gotten to know because she had written an article about one of my cases years before that. Expecting to get some response back that said, because if you know Pam, and some of you probably do know Pam, she's very nice. She's very polite. So I expected a response that thanks for sending it. It's very good. Here's some thoughts I have on where you might want to send it to get it published. But Oh, about 2 weeks later, I got this email back, and she said, "We love it. We want to publish it." And I couldn't believe it. I really could not believe it. There, some of you here may be old enough to remember when Sally Field got her Academy Award. Remember that? Remember what she said, her famous speech, acceptance speech? "You like me. You really like me." That's kind of the way it was when I got that email. They like it. They really like it. So as it turned out, they decided to publish it, not in the magazine, but on their website. And here's what it was about. In that little town where I grew up, there was a guy named Clifford Bogus, who I went to school with. He was 5 years younger than me. We were in this small town. You know everyone, obviously. We grew up together. He worked for my father in a small business that my father had there in the little town of St. Joe. And so we knew each other growing up. Well, after I came back and became district attorney, I had to deal with the case, with his death penalty case, because in the late 80s, in 1987, Clifford Bogus walked into 2 small grocery stores and murdered the shopkeepers in both of those grocery stores within a 3-week span. One of those was another man that I'd known my entire life, the man who operated the only little grocery store in St. Joe. His name was Frank Carter. And everyone was shocked and surprised and stunned. And the jury took 30 minutes to return a death sentence in that case. Now, I didn't try the case. This was before I came into office. But the case was still pending and still on appeal when I took office. And so in late 1997, as Clifford Bogus was sitting on death row awaiting his execution, and he finally got to the point where it was imminent, and he knew it, he sent me a letter. And I got this letter from death row, and looked at it and opened it up, and it was Clifford asking me for a favor. And that's what he said in his letter. He said, "This is not a legal request. This is not a motion. This is coming from me to you because I know you. I want you to set my execution date on June the 11th, 1998. He didn't say in the letter why, but I was pretty sure I knew why. And I, of course, went and looked at the file, and I was right. It was his birthday. He wanted to die on his birthday. And of course, being the good prosecutor that I was, I said, "Well, hell no." You know, my first thought was, you don't get to pick when you die because you didn't let the victims of your crimes pick when they died. That was my initial thought. But as I kept thinking about this and thinking about Clifford, I thought, why not? Really, why not? Why does it matter? If we're going to take his life, if the state of Texas is going to take this person's life, why does it matter if it's on June 11th, 1998 or some other date? And so eventually what I did was grant his last request. And I asked the judge to set the execution date on his birthday. Now, some of these enterprising lawyers like Neil over here, of course, tried to say that the reason that was now cruel and unusual punishment because he was being executed on his birthday, but it didn't go anywhere. But he made that request of me because he knew me. And I, in fact, had visited him in death row several years before that when I was working for the governor's office. I was scheduled to go watch an execution because I was the person at the governor's office who was in charge of making recommendations to the governor as to whether there would be a stay of execution at that particular time. And there was an execution scheduled, so I went to Huntsville to watch that execution. And it got delayed the day before it was supposed to happen, so I decided to tour death row. And because Clifford was there at that point, I said, "Well, I know somebody here, take me by to see him." So I went by and talked to him. And I think that had an impact on him, and that's probably part of the reason why he sent me that letter. Because he knew I at least cared enough to stop by and see him because I knew him. So the date was set, June 11th, 1998. And on the date, that he was set to be executed, it's hard to describe how I felt. I went to my office. It's a big, stately old courthouse there in Montague. It's been there for many decades. And I locked the door of my office and went in and sat in my office and just waited until I knew that the execution had been carried out. I didn't read about it. I didn't know. I just stayed until the time when I knew that the execution had probably happened. And then I went home. And so that's why I say that the death penalty had a face. Because to me, for me, on June 11, 1998, at 6:21 p.m., the death penalty had a face. I could see his face as I waited. And I can still see it now. And I don't think I will ever forget his face. And I picked the date that he died. And that had a powerful effect on me. And I wanted to write about it. And so that's what caused me to sit down and write that story. And I think that the change that is happening is for the better. I think that people that I heard like Pat speak earlier, every trial lawyer wishes they had a voice like that. I've stood in front of juries many, many times and wished I had that deep, trial lawyer voice. But change is happening. You people are making a difference. Now, a lot of it is because of what's happening with the DNA and those things. And the system is changing. But you people are making a difference. And as I said earlier, I think that in our lifetime, we're going to see this thing end. We're going to see the death penalty end. And this is one former prosecutor who says good riddance. We don't need it. It should go away. Because it hasn't been perfect, as I said in that article. It can't be perfect. And for that reason, it should go away. I want to thank you, Kristen, for inviting me here. It's been a pleasure to be here and meet you. Thank you very much.